We're joined by David Cadier, researcher at CERI, which is the research wing of the French Political Science Institute, Science Po. Thanks for stopping in.
Thank you. Good evening.
Your reaction to what we just heard, how realistic would it be for Emmanuel Macron to play mediator between Alexander Lukashenko and the opposition in Belarus?
Well, I think the EU can maybe have a role as a mediator. And the EU is mainly the member states getting together, agreeing to a common strategy. And I think there France has definitely a role to play. Even though Eastern Europe is not usually, let's say, the traditional précaré of French diplomacy, right? This is not the part of the European neighborhood where France has been more active, except when it comes to diplomacy, to mediation. France is doing mediation in Armenia, and we saw in your news that things are heating up there. France has been mediating between conflicting parties in Ukraine. So I do think that France can play a role, and especially the EU can play a role.
We saw a couple of weeks back Lukashenko make that trip to Moscow. Hasn't been the warmest relationships, I know, between the leaders of those two former Soviet republics. Nonetheless, Vladimir Putin going all in. Does that end any hopes of that mediation, as you say?
Well, but there needs to be something to mediate, and precisely we have to mediate against risks of escalation. And by escalation, we mean indeed Russia stepping in and potential conflict or further violence in Belarus. So I think mediation is also making sure that things do not go out of hand, and also talking to Moscow. I think recently the French president had a phone call with Vladimir Putin on the 14th of September, and he did mention that Russia is to have a role in this Belarusian protest, in the Belarusian dossier, right? And so mediating also means trying to avoid any further escalation. And the presence of the, let's say, Belarusian big neighbor, Russia, is complicating further the equation, certainly.
So mediation, we don't know whether or not it will be accepted. There is another area where you talked about the clashes that have erupted over the weekend between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where France was one of the countries mediating, and has been criticism leveled in that instance for not enough mediation, because when there was a flare-up back in July between those two countries over Nagorno-Karabakh, there was no mediation at the time, and some say that's how we got to this point today.
Yeah, I think it's a good link. And maybe if I just come back briefly on Belarus, probably political dialogue is the right word for Belarus right now, right? Because we need to have a political dialogue between the opposition, the demonstrators, and Lukashenko. Mediation is more of a conflict term, and you're referring to a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, something that's been going on for decades. And yes, there's been a flare-up, and the international mediators have not been able to prevent this flare-up. But I think it's not just about diplomatic settings, diplomatic mediation processes. You also need to have the political will. You also need to have the power to back it. And currently, there is one big power around the table that is not really playing its role anymore of, in a way, not World Cup, but at least the hegemonic power who's overseeing different kind of international relations and preventing such flare-ups and conflicts. And I think you know which power I'm referring to.
Yeah, how do you read Emmanuel Macron's messagings over the past month or two? He's been everywhere. He was just criticizing Hezbollah in Lebanon on Sunday. He has had strong words for Turkey when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean. He is now beginning this trip where he says he's going to meet with Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya, the head of Belarus's opposition. The rest of the EU, do they see it as him asserting himself as a leader of Europe, or is just basically a bit of activism on the part of the French?
I think there is activism. It's about diplomatic activism. There is a risk of overstretch, certainly, because President Macron is trying to be in several places at the same time. These are very complicated dossiers, but where is it the case? First, because there's a multiplication of crises, right? Things are getting very tense in Europe's southern and eastern borders. So there is a need for diplomatic action. But then there is a gap in the offer. Because, as I said, the US is not really present. In the EU, Germany has been following a different approach. It's a traditional German approach, rather through a long dialogue and mediation, maybe less of a flashy diplomatic style than the French one.
There were blunt words when Alexey Navalny was poisoned on the part of Germany.
Yeah, no, I think on this dossier is really one where France and Germany have been working closely together, much more than in the past years, where I think Paris and Berlin did not always find the right tune or the same tune to approach diplomatic affairs. But on the multiplication of crisis, I think President Macron thinks that he must and that he can be active. He must because of the multiplication of crisis, and he can also because he thinks that it's time for Europe to step up and to affirm itself as a diplomatic geopolitical player.
Europe to affirm itself. Does he need to do that for a domestic audience or for his European partners, especially the ones who just agreed to that $750 billion bond buying scheme?
Yeah, and I think this is where the Lithuania visit is indeed very important, because I think he needs to do it for Europe, but he also has a lot of convincing to do among its European partners. Because, as you mentioned, there is sometimes a suspicion among EU partners where France is pretending to speak in the name of Europe. So the upside of this is that France is setting ideas, putting forth some projects and initiatives at the European level. But then there's a lot of work to be done in terms of consensus building, compromise seeking with other Europeans. And precisely the idea of going to Lithuania is a very important one in that regard, because this region is traditionally, let's say, below the French diplomatic radar. Central and Eastern Europe is a region where often you hear from diplomats and analysts that they're not hearing Paris enough, or rather than Paris is not listening to them enough. And I think this is a signal that, well, Paris wants to do that. And it's important for the deal that you mentioned as well, because as you know, President Macron has been criticizing quite a bit the government of Hungary and Poland for the infringements on the rule of law issues. And sometimes when in Warsaw and Hungary, they hear this criticism, they say, well, it's just an Central European position of the French, right? Those populist government trying to defend their, let's say, infringement on the rule of law by saying, well, this is just a traditional French content for this part of Europe. But by going to Lithuania, by going to Slovakia, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, as President Macron didn't see got elected, he proves that no, France has no problem with Central Europe, just with infringement on rule of law.
Okay, I hope the viewer follows me on this one, David Cadier. Today's the day the French unveil their budget for next year. Part of the money for that budget is dependent on the fact that the EU, for the first time ever, is going to borrow money. Some of that money is going to come to France, right? Yeah. The Poles and the Hungarians have both said, look, we're going to block anything that tries to tie the dispersing of that money to rule of law. So when Emmanuel Macron is talking Belarus, again, is it to shore up his chances of getting the money he needs for his domestic budget?
Well, I think there's a genuine admiration on the part of many in France for the courage of the Belarusian demonstrators standing up to a rather brutal regime. And so I don't think we necessarily need to see some kind of calculation. At the same time, the European game is exactly also about trying to change the rapport de force, the relationship between the different countries. And the Belarus is important for the rule of law because Poland has been very active on the Belarus dossier and saying that it wants to support, and I'm quoting an official document signed by Poland, Lithuania and Romania, saying that these countries want to help Belarus building democratic processes and the rule of law. So we're in a situation where some countries are criticized by the EU for not following the rule of law principles, but then want to promote them abroad. And so I think that indeed Emmanuel Macron, by saying that, okay, we need to stand up for democratic processes in Belarus, we need to push for rule of law, I think maybe in the back of his mind he also says that, well, it's maybe good that those who respect it at home also do that.
One final question for you. You've made the point that at least Macron's an ideas man, but sometimes does he have too many ideas? Last week, he gives that speech before the United Nations. The start of the speech, like in previous years, a stark contrast to what we'd heard just a few minutes earlier from Donald Trump. And then it went on for 40 minutes.
Absolutely. No, I think probably there's some kind of a firework dynamic in terms of diplomatic ideas. And I don't think it's good for diplomacy, because diplomacy works within a very long time frame. And so when you see an idea going, I think in different diplomatic chancellery, among Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they want to analyze what is the proposal, what is our position on this proposal, what should be our answer. But by then, there are 3 other ideas fired, right? And so I think probably at times the diplomacy of the French president lacks clarity or sense of direction, precisely because of the number of ideas, this kind of reactivity, this kind of disruptive style. But I should add disruptive style, but at the service of very traditional priorities and position of the French foreign policy and French diplomacy. It's disruptive in the method, but I don't think it's disruptive in terms of the content of his diplomacy or his foreign policy.
All right, David Cadier of Science Po's CERI research branch, many thanks for being with us.
Thank you.